Hello, welcome back to Math Time with Professor Prime, and I am your host as always, Professor Prime. Today we're going to talk about math and language barriers. I'm going to give you some background to how we got to this topic, and then we're going to dig right in. Recently, I had a dream. In that dream, there was a friend. That friend was doing some math. That friend asked me for some help. I gladly obliged. Now, some of those problems were very technical in nature, standard fare. And to me, they're interesting in their own right. However, what was really interesting was one question at the end of that particular problem set. That question was this: are there language barriers in math? And I thought that was a fascinating question. And in the dream, I had an amazing conversation with my friend. And I'm going to discuss what we discussed in the dream with you. And I'm going to do so in a fleshed out way. And I want to say this before we go too far in this. It's fundamentally bonkers that I'm doing this. And I say that because I dreamt this. I had a whole conversation in my dream with my friend. And so I feel like my brain was working overtime. It's good on you, subconscious. I'm here for it. So I'm glad that my subconscious did what it did. I'm glad that my dream version of my friend was there and that we worked together and we had this amazing conversation. And I'm glad that I'm consciously having this conversation with you right now. So let's get into it. So with language barriers, the idea is that there are issues in communication that stem from people not understanding each other's language, right? And that's the simple way of putting it. Because the reality of it is that it gets complicated quickly. Because when we talk about those problems that come into play with communication based on someone's language, language can take many forms. We could be talking about spoken language. We could be talking about written language. We could be talking about sign language, body language. We could be talking about visual language. We could be talking about so many different things, right? And with those languages, they have different dialects. With those languages, they're used region to region, culture to culture, and there are idiosyncrasies that come with all that. So, you got these different languages with different dialect, with, different cultures using these languages and with idiosyncrasies developing. And so, yeah, communication can get complicated quickly. But, the things that I mentioned, they're not the only way of communication, of course, right? There's a lot of other different ways. But I want to mention that when we talk about different fields, when we talk about different subjects, when we talk about interests of ours, not only do we use the languages that I mentioned before, and some more, but those things within themselves develop their own language. And how someone discusses those things within those circles varies from person to person, culture to culture. So things can get complicated quickly, and language barriers they can get intense. And here's the thing, right? There's more to it than that, right? Because sarcasm, for instance, that can be wild. That can be confusing to a lot of people, especially if you're writing it, for instance. So it can get complicated, and a joke may not land or sarcasm might not stick because of language barriers, and they within themselves can create further language barriers. In any case, now that I've talked about all of those things, I want to talk about how language barriers are used in math, or the ones that exist in math. Because you can take all the things that I mentioned before, right, and you can apply that to math, and they'd be valid. But if we focus in on math specifically, it can get pretty wild. Because not only do we have all those other language barriers that I mentioned, but math, we don't always talk about what it actually is and what comes with that. Because for me, I look at it this way: math on a universal level is what we do. It's what the universe does and how it works. When we're talking about math on an academic level, we're then trying to communicate what's going on out there, right? We're trying to communicate what the world is already doing, what the universe is already doing. We're trying to say something about the past, the present, the future, ourselves. And we're trying to use the results. We're trying to find a way to just be able to talk about everything. And here's the thing: when we do that, right, we're communicating in so many different ways, but we don't discuss it like that. And that baffles me. When we're talking about math on an academic level, right, we are getting into language, right? Math on that level is a language, and we don't treat it as such. It has its own vocabulary, its own syntax, its own grammar, and we don't treat it like that. When you're solving a math problem, you are writing. You are writing an essay, an argument style essay. You're trying to prove something or disprove something. And there's a flow to it, and there's a rhythm to it. And we don't talk about any of that. And so I feel like because we don't, it's not always clear what we're asking to people. And because we don't stress vocabulary, there's a lot of confusion. And so with math and how it's structured and as we know it on a regular level, on an academic level, it can be confusing in its own right and provide so many language barriers because we're not even sure that we're speaking a language, but we are. And that's wild to me. But it doesn't stop there, right? Because, right, you get into the idea of notation. And there's so many different ways to write something out. But there's so many different ways to not only express something notationally speaking, but express something in general, right? Like take fractions, percents, and decimals, right? There are three ways to talk about the same thing, parts of a larger number. And right, that's a small thing, right? But there's so many different ways that you can write out an equation. There's so many different ways that you could go about like the finer points like addition. And due to all of the nuance there is when it comes to like learning math, I could see why the language barriers could be an issue. But it does not stop there, because of course it doesn't. And I could go on all day about what I'm about to talk about, but I think one example will help you get what I mean. So when it comes to math and how we talk about it, how we write it out, it varies region to region, culture to culture. Now, take decimals, or rather, take the use of a period and a comma when we're talking about decimals in thousands. It kind of went off, which is kind of appropriate because the numbers they keep on getting larger, but we're not gonna go there. Um, so, when it comes to decimals, though, over here in the States, if I'm talking about like let's say 1.5. So I have one of something and then a half of it, right? If I want to discuss that like and write that out over here in the States, then I'm going to say like 1.5, right? I'm using a period to denote decimals. But if I'm over in, let's say, a lot of places in Europe, for instance, then I'm going to say 1.5 because that comma is denoting decimals there. And then you get to like thousands. Say I want to write out 1,000. I could write 1000 and that'd be fine, but as we're getting higher and higher, it's easier to start denoting larger numbers in a way that makes sense to us visually. So just like for 1,000, over here in the States, I'd say 1,00. However, over in Europe, let's say, they would use a decimal to denote thousands. So they would say 1.00. And this alone could be confusing because you could, let's say, be reading some sort of book or some sort of paper, and it could be from another country, and you could get thrown off because you're not used to that particular branch of notation. And I could see why this could be confusing. And I had like a student once where they had that issue. They grew up in like France, and they came to me and they asked if it was okay to use that notation. I said it was okay because I would get what they meant, right? Because I knew what their name was, I knew what they were doing, and what was happening on that paper. So for me, that wasn't an issue, and we were able to like talk about that because they weren't comfortable with the way we had notation over here. So I'm like, hey, it's all good. Like if you've written out everything, I can work with that. And I wish more of those sort of conversations happened because we have people going all over to like the world to different places, and we don't talk about these differences that much. Like you kind of be hard pressed to find them out there. So I wish this conversation sort of happened, but more. But in any case, I don't want this to get too long. So I'll say this. Language is complicated. It comes in many different forms. Language barriers can happen at the drop of a hat. And if you take just them and how they are, they're enough in their own right. But then math has its own specific language barriers, in addition to all of the other language barriers that we have to worry about on a daily basis. So if you struggled with math, or you're struggling with math, or you know someone who does, I get it. And I'm hoping that you'll think of it this way. Like, you can make it work. And even if you're not in a position right now, you could do that. And I think it's worth noting that regardless of how you're learning about math in school, it doesn't change the fact that you're a natural mathematician. You do math all the time. We all do, right? You can't be good at something that you already do and do so naturally. What you do in the classroom, it's a different story, but I think the take home message should be like the stuff in the classroom, the ways to communicate what's going on out there in the world. That's something you can learn. To be out there in the world, to exist, to go about your everyday lives, to do all the things that you do. That requires math, and it's math that you're doing already. So no matter how you cut it, you're doing math, and I hope that you can get past the language barriers that come with it. You can, and I hope that happens for you when you need it to. Professor Prime out.